Those missionaries knew the goal. Let's win them to Christ and teach them to obey Jesus. Is there any question what our goal is? Someone says, Jeff, are you working for a theocracy? Have you been listening? Yes!
I'm here to declare that Jesus is not just king over all creation, minus Washington, D.C., but he's king over all creation, period. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
We are living in the cesspool of relativism, and the church doesn't have an answer. How many times can a man turn his head and pretend he doesn't see?
Welcome to the Solo Like Stay podcast. I am your host, Gil Wroten. Today I am joined by Luke Saint. Luke is the president of the Board of Future of Christendom, author of The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, and host of the Think and Reform podcast. Today we are going to be talking about the future of Christian Reconstruction and non-legislative theonomy. So welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Gil. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start off by just getting into some of your background, upbringing, kind of hear how you started getting into the topics of Christian Reconstruction.
A lot of it was growing up in a house where my parents were the ones who really were getting into it. They kind of started that trend. They were the ones who began with that approach. I had grown up around my dad talking with other people on the phone about Rushdoony and about Bonson and about North and all that kind of stuff. And I grew up in a house where my parents were already embracing the Reconstructionist mindset. Like, you know, if good things are going to happen in society, it's got to be through the scriptures. It's got to be through the word. It's got to be through the church, you know, things like that. And it's got to be through, you know, recognizing Christ as King and through God's law. So I kind of grew up with that and didn't really understand it 100%. But the older I got and the more that I was confronted with the questions I had about how do we deal with the communists? How do we deal with the socialists? And after a while, I started questioning. I mean, the most important thing about my upbringing was I grew up in a house where there was the Bible and there was everything else. Thankfully, I grew up with that. I think every house should grow up with that. And I think that's asking a lot nowadays. I think people grow up in a house where there's the Bible, the traditions, and the confession, then there's everything else. And sometimes they grow up in a house where there's a confession and there's everything else. Unfortunately, it's just the way it's becoming. Or they grew up in a house where, you know, maybe there's Cicero and then everything else, the Romans and the Greeks, and then there's everything else. And the Bible is just one of the many options that you can kind of glance at, just kind of like a lot of our framers. Well, yeah, they say, well, Deuteronomy was the most quoted book that they quoted. Yeah, but it's kind of like the least one implemented, right? I mean, they kind of went with everyone else's ideas, and even though they quoted Deuteronomy a lot, they kind of went with other people's like plans. They didn't really follow the biblical model of government, hardly at all. They kind of went with, you know, Locke and these other guys, and that was probably the most important thing about my upbringing. Was I grew up in a house where my dad and my mom both lived like there's this thing called the Bible and it's God's word, and then there's everything else that's questionable, that's not authoritative. It can be useful and you can glean wisdom from it, and there's different degrees of each document you want to bring up in a given situation of which one is more faithful to the scriptures. But there's one perfect standard by which we judge all these other things. And that was the most important thing that I grew up with in my house, was this attitude from my parents that there was the scriptures and there was just everything else. And that's what really helped me a lot in my mindset about when I approach the role of the civil magistrate.
You had mentioned on Adam Terrell's podcast, he asked you a little bit about your background. You said that you were like that at some point your parents came from like a dispensational background.
Yes.
And then Could you tell me, did they come to theonomy at some point while you were still like in a time where you can remember, or come to postmillennialism at a time you can remember?
While my dad came from my mom and my dad both came from Washington Bible College, which was rapture fever back in the 70s, and 88 reasons for the rapture in 88 and all that kind of stuff. Um, I don't remember them actually teaching us dispensationalist theology. My dad, I'm not sure when he became a Calvinist, but he tells a lot of stories that kind of led him along the way to when he became Calvinist, but he didn't come from a Calvinist background. His parents were dispensational, but the thing is, my grandpa David, my dad talks about him positively like all the time, and he talks about how Dave, even though he's this dispensationalist, he still had the attitude that he taught my dad, that there's the Bible and then there's everything else. My dad grew up in that environment as well, and that was important for my dad's upbringing, and that really helped him develop his theology, because there really was in my grandpa's house, even though he was dispensational, premillennial, the whole 9 yards, um, he still had this respect for the Bible that I think a lot of our forefathers grew up with. Something that we missed from American culture was, even though they were I believe my grandpa was inconsistent in some places with his interpretation of the Bible. Um, I think that his approach was faithful to the scriptures, and to him there was the Bible and there was everything else. And he taught that to my dad, and my dad taught that to us. But I don't remember my parents ever teaching us, hey, listen, the rapture's coming soon, and here's your rapture kit, and all that kind of stuff. And we were, by the time the Left Behind books came out, we were all just kind of laughing at the whole thing and the silliness.
Hmm. Do you do you remember a time where you started reading or just discussing Christian Reconstruction with friends or with family, where it became something that you wanted to personally be devoted to and kind of work within that arena?
When it started when my dad and some faithful men started a group called the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. And that was started probably about 12 years ago, maybe 13,
Hmm.
14 years ago. Um, and I guess that, um, they were mostly older men, probably in ranging from the late 50s to the like even early 70s. One of the men, Bob Salzman, who was a man who started a lot of Christian schools, had his hand in a lot of Christian schools. He was part of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, but he passed away tragically. And when he did, uh, the Mars guys, the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, they asked me to join. And from that point on, when they asked me to join the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, that kind of gave me an indication that if these guys took me seriously, then they um, thought that I had something to contribute. And so I kind of started to take my theology just a little bit more serious after that, after they asked me to join. Um, because I'd been talking with individuals of them, and I was a I even before I joined, I was kind of sold out for the law of God. A lot of it had to do with reading Psalm 119 in its context, and just looking at the claims of Psalm 119. If I could point to any document, it was Psalm 119 more than ever. That kind of really just picked me up by the back of my shirt and just threw me into the room of Reconstruction. um, I just couldn't get away from it, because since growing up in a house where there was a Bible and everything else, and Psalm 119 is kind of like there's like the law and then there's everything else. And so I identified with that attitude, and I was like, this is quite a thing to quite these are quite things to say about a system and laws that I didn't understand at the time. I didn't understand everything, but I was like, well, you know what? If the psalmist has this attitude, and this is the Holy Spirit talking, well, then I'm going to take that attitude. I'm going to look at the law like it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm going to look at the law like it really can teach me about life, that it's wisdom, that it's knowledge, that it can teach me about who God is, and can teach me how to live and love my neighbor. I decided that if the psalmist can do that, what's good enough for him, that's good enough for me, obviously. And I had that attitude before I joined Mars, and I think it was that attitude that helped me join, that helped them take me seriously, because I was talking to them on and off at like at church and in other events I would attend sometimes, and um, it was that attitude, I think, that they looked at me and they said, okay, this guy's serious. And I think it was John Bingaman, I think it was, who said to my dad, Luke knows what we're trying to do here. And uh, I think that was a good reason for them to invite me to be part of the Mennonite Reformation Society. When I became a part of them, we started planning conferences, and planning these conferences and inviting speakers really forces you to look at, what do these speakers believe? What do these speakers promote? What do they affirm? What do they deny? And you kind of have to come into every speaker kind of has this air of controversy about them, because I think probably every single speaker we've invited, if you look long and hard enough and ask them enough questions, you can find some sort of controversial belief that they have. And I think that's true for every Christian when you search enough. And because of that, I had to face all these isms. Well, this guy believes in this. Oh, should we invite him? Well, how serious is it? Well, I don't know. Let's look. You know, and that really forced me to get involved with the arguments of Reconstruction at the time, because we were inviting Reconstructionist speakers to our conferences at the time. And so that was kind of like the gateway, where I said, if these godly men respect what I'm saying, then I should probably respect a little bit more this calling that, apparently the Lord has given me to be part of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. It was quite a serious thing in my mind.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Could you tell me, so obviously you've been a part of these Reconstruction circles for a little bit of time, and
Yeah,
when I sort of started to get introduced to some of the ideas of Reconstruction, it was post COVID, and around that time, guys like Doug Wilson and Apologia and the Ezra Institute, and at the time Joel Webben were like the guys that were starting to at least just put information out there about Reconstruction.
yeah.
Um, and I'd be curious to see, or just to hear from you, how you've seen Reconstruction circles kind of shift over those years.
The well, I mean, it's no great secret that um, a lot of the Reconstructionists of yore didn't work well together. Uh, Gary North married Rushdoony's daughter, um, and they apparently, I can't confirm this with like hard evidence, but I heard they split fellowship over the tithe. The tithe. They split fellowship over their interpretation of the application of the tithe. And to me, I just look at that and I laugh to myself. But you know what? Um, every time that I think something is foolish, and I get into the arguments and I see how people tie it, I can see how seriously they take it, and I understand. Okay, this person takes it very. I wouldn't have taken it very seriously, but this person does. And so Christian Reconstruction, that any sort of timeline that you can point to really started with Van Til and Rushdoony, and maybe Van Til was the godfather, but Rushdoony was the father. I mean, there's no getting around that. I mean, his stuff is still good to this day. You read it, it's like I can't believe that this guy saw this coming. I mean, it was Rushdoony, nothing but net. From the cheap seats, from the nosebleeds, just nothing but net. I mean, he just saw it. He was a prophet. And uh, but you know, even back in that time, you thought that these big guys would get together and they would unify and work towards Reconstruction, but it was kind of difficult. And the spirit of that dissent moved on even into the when 2016, 2017, when I was getting into these circles and I was part of some Facebook groups. that we're trying to do what Theonomy Q&A is doing, and that is let's talk about these biblical things. Let's get together, put our heads together, and let's have discourse and back and forth on what do you think about this and what do you think about that. Let's pick each other's brains. Well, it turned from picking each other's brains to kicking each other's butts pretty quickly, um, because the spirit of disagreement, and I have to kind of associate it with North, his son-in-law, Joel McDurmon. He was one of the leaders of Christian Reconstruction at the time. He was like kind of like the Joel Webben. He was like our guy, and some other guys, Gary DeMar, um, um, even Peter Hammond was involved. I'm not sure if you heard his name. Um, and Bo Marinoff. These guys were kind of leading Christian Reconstruction at the time, and they were. I mean, I don't think McDermott and Marinov are good people. I don't. Um, we had a dust up with them where they accused me and everyone at the Mennonite Reformation Society of being racist. They thought we were all kinists. That was like there was this huge kinist dust up because we had invited Peter Hammond, Dr. Peter Hammond from Africa to be a speaker, and he was an avowed kinist. And we invited him to our conference, and there were some people, some of the leaders of Christian Reconstruction that tried to destroy us because of that. They tried to paint us as kinists and racists, and they said, if you're a kinist, then that means you're a racist. It was a bad time for Christian Reconstruction because these leaders were leaning very hard left. They were taking hard left turns into like it was morphing from Christian Reconstruction to social justice, and you have to ask yourself, how in the world did that happen? But it did. You can probably go back and look at the discussions. I still, from time to time, go back and look at the crazy things that were said by these people as they started to go into social justice and kind of like using the Bible as an excuse to do that, and they were turning into white people are guilty just because they're white, and you're like, how is this possible? But it was happening, and they tried to use us as the scapegoat, and other people too. It wasn't just us, but they tried to say like, there's kinists infiltrating Reconstruction. We need to kick them all out, and we need to punish them, and we need to make an example of them, and articles were written, podcasts were recorded, memes were made, and all that kind of stuff. And there was this great divide in Christian Reconstruction back in 2017, 2018. And that kind of all went away after we had our conference. Like a lot of it was put into the conference of that year. We invited Peter Hammond. They tried to basically destroy that conference. And when we still had the conference, they kind of lost a lot of their how do I put this? A lot of their energy because it didn't work. We still had the conference, and we had a great conference, and Peter Hammond came, and other Reconstructionist leaders came, and from then on, Joe McDermott was basically kicked out of Reconstruction. He was the head of American Vision at the time. Gary DeMar came back and kicked him out because he was promoting leftist propaganda, essentially. And then Marinoff went silent. He went off somewhere, who knows where, and kind of hasn't been the same ever since. And we just kept right on going with our conferences. But yeah, a lot of it had changed. A lot of it's changed since then. There's a lot less leftist push among Christian Reconstruction now. It's very biblically based. When I look at the Theonomy Q&A group, it is true, like we were talking about before. There are people in there trying to work through biblical issues, and from what I understand, we're staying away strongly from cancel culture. And to do that, you kind of have to feed the trolls, and that's what I like to do personally. I like feeding the trolls in the group, but there's a lot of fruit that comes out of that sometimes if you stick with it long enough. But yeah, the focus back in the 2017, 2018 before COVID was let's kick out of Christian Reconstruction was there's kinists and racists trying to infiltrate. Let's kick them all out before we're all racists. And COVID hit. We had a conference, and then COVID hit, and then a lot of the focus shifted back to how do we stop the state from being out of control? And that is like now we're back on track. We're back on the right view here. Okay, we're looking at the right things. We're stop worrying about these shadowy racists. And obviously the kids are a problem, but um, they try to use us as a scapegoat and as an example. And we're obviously not kinnists. We're not racists. And no one's ever apologized for. I mean, they said horrible things about my wife
Mm.
because my wife is Brazilian, and from her father's side, she's descended from. I'm pretty sure she's descended from slaves. Her mother's side, she's descended from the indigenous people of Brazil. And they said some horrible things about her. The people who were supposed to be anti-kinist said worse things about my wife than any kinist would ever say. Because I knew some kinnists and no one ever said anything bad about my wife. To this day, they haven't said anything about that. But these people who are trying to be like, oh, we're all about protecting marriages, and we love mixed race marriages. They said horrible things about my wife. Um, so I mean, it just kind of said in my mind they're frauds and hypocrites, and I'm glad they're gone, and nobody really looks at them as Reconstructionists anymore. They've been kind of like disgraced. Um, and so after COVID, the focus came back on, okay, let's get back on track here because we can't afford, like everyone's talking about the overreach of the state, so we got to go back to that. And ever since then, Christian Reconstruction, from what I understand, has been focused back on how do we get the state back under the purview of God's word.
Hmm.
Sorry, I'm getting all these notifications. Are you hearing all this? All these
I'm
notifications again?
no, no, I'm not
No? Oh, great. Excellent. I'm glad you're not getting them because I'm getting phone calls and I'm hearing them through my computer because my phone is hooked up to my computer. I'm glad you're not hearing them.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. So yeah, during COVID, it kind of forced us to go back to wait a sec. What was this all about? What were we doing? And got us focused back on the problem of like, okay, how do we save the babies? How do we stop the state, the perversion of the state, and get this reform the state, just like the reformers reformed the Catholic Church. Obviously, it was perverse. And when COVID hit, that kind of forced us all to look back, and I think I want to say we've been doing that ever since.
yeah, yeah, and I think also you would probably agree with this is there's been a shift with the Christian nationalism movement, and that's something I'm sure we're going to get into
Yes.
soon. Um, y'all are known as the Lancaster guys, Lancastrian theonomy, non-legislative theonomy. So I'd be interested to hear how non-legislative theonomy developed.
I remember the first time I pitched it to my friend Ron Kranz, and it was the first time I had ever said aloud, "That's why you," and I concluded the argument with, "That's why you can't have a legislature." And Ron was sitting, I remember where we were. We were sitting, we had just come back from um, the Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C. If I remember correctly, Ron had baptized his granddaughter there, which I'm not a Presbyterian or I don't believe in baby baptism, but man, I was glad, I was honored to be part of that. Really, truly an honor. I am so proud to be part of that event and absolutely went out there to support him. He baptized his baby in front of Planned Parenthood, which is totally awesome. And on the way back, we were going to the church, and we were in the van, and we are all talking, and I got onto one of my my monologues, and I concluded the argument, and I remember the way he was looking at me was, um, he was looking at me like I was like an alien. He was just like interested, but not really sure how to treat me after what I just said. And it was really funny. And I was just like, okay, so if this is what I'm going to believe and explain, I've got to help these people who've never heard or never thought about life without what would life without a legislature look like? What would life look like if I could look 30, 40, 50 years down the future and say, okay, the law's not going to change. The law's going to be the same. And that mentality, I realized, was something we didn't have as Americans. We live our life like the law could change at any second. And that taints our view of justice. That taints our view of the future. It taints our view of the past. And I kind of realized to myself, okay, well, I'd better flesh this out a little bit more because I don't want to get confused looks from Ron in the future. And if you ever get the chance to read Ron's material, he's coming out with another one, another book as well. His stuff is really great because it's delivered from a pastor who's actually done the things that he encourages or tells other people to do. A very faithful pastor in the street and in the pulpit, and I think that's the solution to our problems right there. Faithful pastors in the pulpit and in the street. Just an aside there. Um, a lot of it probably started with the claims of Psalm 119, and I guess I started to compare the claims of Psalm 119, and I thought to myself, can I say this about the Constitution? All of its ways are just, I consider all of its ways to be right. And I started to realize as I looked into biblical law that the Constitution and the biblical law didn't line up. But I was talking to people who kind of treated them like they were the same thing. They would say things like, "Yeah, we need to get back to the Bible," and I'd say, "Yeah," and then they'd say, "Well, that's why we got to get back to the Constitution." And studying the biblical law, I realized that this is way different than the constitutional system. To follow the Constitution is to betray biblical law, and to follow biblical law is to betray the Constitution. There's just different things in there that contradict each other. I remember I was at a mini conference by Paul Michael Raymond's church down there in Virginia, and there was a speaker there named Don Schanzenbach, and he was the first person to indicate to me in his speech. He said the Bible only recognized one branch, and that was judicial branch. And I thought about that for a long time, and then I came across there was a pastor at our church at the time, the church I was attending at the time, that was reading through Judges, and he just casually read that the land had rest for 40 years. And it kind of hit me when I was listening. I was like, but we've never had 40 years of rest in this country. The longest period of rest we had was between the Puritans and the Indians before America was started, and that was 60 years, if I remember correctly. And which I think is totally awesome. But then after the Constitution, we never had 40 years of rest. We had wars, and we've been at war with our children ever since 1973. We've been at war with our own people ever since 1913. And I was like, they were so bad back then, right? I mean, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Clearly it must have been chaos all the time. How in the world did they get 40 years and then 80 years and then 40 years and then 40 years? How did they do this? And then I started to try to let the Bible teach me about, okay, this is how you do justice. Um, this is how you do government. And I was like, okay, I'm going to let the Bible teach me rather than bringing the Constitution and dumping it on the Bible and trying to make the Bible fit into the Constitution. I'm going to let the Bible teach me how to do government. And because I saw that their government was absolutely superior. And then I noticed one thing is that Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32 outlawed a legislature. It said, "You shall not add to the word I'm giving you today, and you shall not take away from it." But what does legislature do? Well, it adds laws. That's all it does. Right? Very rarely does it get rid of laws. It just keeps adding and adding and adding. And um, I was reading books at the time that were kind of indicating to me. I started to question, wait, do we need like all these new laws? I think we're going the wrong direction. With Christians, we're like, there should be a law, there should be a law, there should be a law. And I noticed that the Bible was able to have a peaceful, righteous, godly society where the righteous were thriving, the wicked were not, with just a very few amount of laws that didn't change over the 400-year course of their history. And I saw that once they got rid of God's judicial system, it started with a rejection of God, and it ended with a rejection of his judicial system. They wanted a completely new governmental system. They wanted a king. And the warning from Samuel, I remember I learned this from one of my dad's presentation at the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. Samuel's warning to the people was, he's going to take, he's going to take, he's going to take, right? I mean, he's just going down the list of what this king is going to do, and they still wanted it. And I thought to myself, well, if this king, I mean, if you compare what the king was taking back then to what he's taking today, what the state is taking today, man, I mean, that was so much better back then, and that was considered a very bad warning, an indictment against the Israelites that you're doing a stupid and foolish thing. And I tell you, if our state took as little as Saul took, I'd be dancing in the streets. I'd be like, oh, thank goodness they're only back to taking a tenth. Wow, this is great. But then I thought that, wait a second, but Samuel's saying this is new. And I read there in Samuel, 1 Samuel 12:8, when he says, I want you guys to swear to me I never did anything wrong to you. And they said, we swear you never took it. You never took anything from us. And then by 1 Kings 12:8, you have the people coming to Rehoboam and saying, hey, can you relax a little bit? You know, your father's burden was heavy on us. Can you take it easy on us? This apparently was never a complaint against any of the judges, that they took things from people. And if they did, it was isolated and it wasn't systematic. Whereas the kings, it was systematic. It was everybody. Whereas the problems with the judges were isolated. They weren't institutional. And I was shocked by that the system that had I was kind of like led to believe, as I was growing up, not from my parents, but from, like, just general Christian theology at the time, that it was God's law was kind of a bad idea. His system didn't work. It was a failure. Judges is a book of chaos. And then when I started to look at the evidence, I was like, this is not chaos. If you're going to airdrop me at any point in the Bible, definitely at the beginning of, was it Gideon who saw 80 years? I forget which judge saw 80 years. I forget which one saw 80 years of rest. That's where I'm starting right there. Day one, airdrop me in there. I'm going to live a long, full life in a country that doesn't see war for 80 years and doesn't see institutional wickedness for 80 years. And I'm like, there's no other point in the Bible like that I would be airdropped into, with maybe the exception of, like, okay, maybe Jesus' ministry for those 3 years. But other than that, like, if I'm going to live back then, that's where I'm going. And I thought doesn't make sense with the way that general Christian theology is teaching me. They're teaching me this was a time of chaos. And I started to realize that we were eisegeting judges and we were not exegeting it. And we weren't taking its claims seriously. And from there, I started to develop the idea, not necessarily the idea, but I believe the faithful application of God's law. I've never seen commentary on Deuteronomy 4:2 or 12:32. I've never heard anyone say it, even Rushdoony and North and Bonson. I've never heard any of them talk about it. I've heard nobody talk about it. That law, don't add to it, don't take away from it. And for the people who are like general theonomists, are like, yeah, God's law's principles. I started to think, well, what's the principle of this law? Don't add to God's law, don't take away from it. What's the principle there? Because there's no limit, there's no cap that our Constitution puts on the legislature. Whatever they pass becomes law. I started realizing that's a bad idea. Wow, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. Maybe we should start thinking about life without a legislature. Maybe a legislature's been a bad idea the whole time. And so far, every time I look throughout history, every time you see a legislature, very rarely are they instituting good things. They're almost always instituting bad things and making it worse for people. Not all the time, but I think that was Cromwell's problem that he had with Parliament. He got rid of the king. Okay, the king's gone. Okay, Parliament, do your thing. He'd leave and he'd come back and he'd find out that they're passing wicked laws. And he'd disband them, put new guys in there, leave, come back. They were doing the same thing again. He kept disbanding Parliament, and he kept giving them a chance. And till finally he said, okay, I have to do this by myself, I guess. And that's when the Protectorate started. But I think he saw the problem. I'm not sure if he necessarily saw the solution as effectively as he could have, because he's a product of his time, and he was already far thinking, very far ahead of his time as well. And so once I started to take seriously the biblical laws that I was like, nobody's talking about these laws. What are we going to do with these laws? How do we apply these laws? Where don't add or don't take away to God's law. We're violating that, right? We are. And I started to realize the general equity theonomists were not necessarily trying to be faithful to the scriptures. They were trying to be faithful to the confessions. That's what they were using that term for. It wasn't about, because the Bible doesn't use that term, general equity. And I started to smell a rat when we were taking the confessions, and the confessions applied to everyone for all time, but God's law didn't. God's law was something for them back then. It was good for them, and it served its purpose. But now we have the confessions for everyone, everywhere, at all times. And I thought that was very contra-biblical. That was eisegesis in my mind. The Bible never says it was just good for them. And when I came across 1 Timothy 1, 8-11, I was like, there's the passage that everyone's looking for. Where's Paul bringing, talk about God's law? I'm like, there it is right there. It's very obvious. But if you're not looking for it, then you won't see it. If you don't want to see it, you'll never see it. And I realized, because of our bad attitude I suspect our bad attitude towards God's law, that as long as we had a bad attitude towards God's law, we were never going to be able to read 1 Timothy 1, 8-11 in its proper context. There's going to be no category for that passage to land in our minds. And it's going to bounce right off our brains and keep on going, because it can't be that the law of God is good if it's used lawfully, because the law of God's bad. It didn't work. It was a failure. And I started to suspect that the reason that there was no application for this passage in Timothy was because there was no application for God's law in these people's lives. So those are just a few things that I started to realize in my my attempt to develop what Chris Hume has called a more developed form of theonomy, and I agree with him. I think it is developed more. I think it answers more questions than general equity theonomy. And like I told you before, I think general equity theonomy is just Christian Nationalist Junior, and Christian Nationalist Junior is just Catholic Junior. So I think that Lancastrian theonomy or non-legislative theonomy, which in my opinion it's just theonomy. It's what it should be called, but we have to use these labels to differentiate. Unfortunately, I would just like to call it theonomy. But until we can, as theonomists, kind of assume the same definition as the other theonomists, I think we still have to differentiate. So those are some of the, sorry, that was long, but those are some of the things that I was wrestling with back in probably 2017, 2018, 2019. And I remember also, I saw a friend on Facebook ask the question, okay, let's say we did theonomy. What would that look like? And I started to think about that. What would it look like? And I started to look at God's law about, okay, what does this all look like? That also helped me view, like if I was living back in Israel, what would I expect? What would my frame of mind be regarding the civil magistrate? I started to view the Bible or the law through the eyes of, if I was living back at that time, what would I do? And so a lot of friends gave me some resources. I know Kevin and Emily Amundsen, they gave me resources from John Eliot, who, interestingly enough, my great uncle Nate Saint was killed, one of the 5 missionaries killed in Ecuador back in 1956. With him was another Eliot, Jim Eliot, who was a descendant from John Eliot. John Eliot was a missionary to the Indians back in the 1600s, and he basically recommended God's governmental system with leaders of 10, leaders of 100, leaders of 1,000. And he was trying to get the Indians to organize themselves politically according to that structure. the crown was so offended by it, they made him recant and apologize. And he did, because they said, if you don't, we won't let you minister to the Indians anymore. And he wanted to minister to the Indians, so he did.
Hmm.
But they showed that to me. And then also I remember in a podcast I was listening to about Cromwell, because I love Cromwell. A guy was giving him a very fair shake. I don't think he was a Cromwell fan. It was called Revolutions. It's a podcast about revolutions. He just talks about political revolutions. And he was talking about, I think the first one he did was the English Civil War of the 1640s. And he talked about, he just a very small comment as an aside. He talked about these people who were a sect of Christianity at the time called, they believed in something called the Fifth Kingdom. And it's an appendix at the end of my book by William Aspinwall, who wrote a treatise saying, there's a lot of things in there that I don't agree with, but he basically makes the non-legislative theonomy case back in the 1600s. And he says, why do we need parliament? We have God's law. Why don't we just use it the way that God told us to use it? And I actually read it after I wrote my book, but as I was searching for appendices, I was like, wow, I can't believe I came to the same conclusions as he did, 400 years apart, basically. And so I included it as an appendix at the end of my book. But I knew I wasn't the first person to really think of it in those terms.
Yeah, actually, so I mean, at a decently early time in my sort of reading within theonomy and reconstruction, I came across one of the podcasts that you did with your dad, because I was trying to find a podcast that responded to McDermott on the Karam principle. You were
Yes.
doing a podcast where you were responding to it with your dad, and I'm not sure, maybe somebody else. Um,
Yeah,
and you had
yeah.
just mentioned non-legislative theonomy. And so like it immediately, as I heard it, it just clicked, because there's no legislative branch in the Mosaic economy, if that's like how you would want to phrase that. And so that kind of immediately clicked. And then as I've been reading through Rushdoony and North and Bonson, and even guys like, so Meredith Kline, I sent a quote in Theonomy Q&A sometime this summer, because Meredith Kline, he wrote comments on an old new error, which was one of the responses to Rushdoony and Bonson really early on. And Bonson goes, there's a whole story behind it where he essentially, Klein makes it so that Bonson cannot respond within Westminster's Theological Journal. But anyway, Meredith Kline, who's obviously a pretty serious critic of theonomy and reconstruction, in his book Treaty of the Great King, he he's commenting on Deuteronomy, and then when he gets to Deuteronomy 4:2, he mentions that it would forbid legislation. And so I
Mm.
thought that was interesting. And then right now I'm working on a project, so I'm going through Bonson's exegesis on Matthew 5:17 to 19 in Theonomy and
Yes.
Christian Ethics. He
Yes.
quotes Deuteronomy, well, at least he references or either like makes kind of like a general quote of Deuteronomy 4:2, I think three times just in his exegesis of Matthew 5:17 to 19.
Wow.
And so like, I'm compiling stuff right now, but I definitely think at the minimum what you have with some of the early Reconstructionists is some theological schizophrenia. Because the
Mm.
reality is all of us have blind spots. All of us, like it was in a lot of ways what they were talking about was completely radical. I mean, Bonson's essentially pushed out, if not kicked out, from RTS 1 year after working there. So I
Yeah.
doubt that they were thinking, what are all of the ways that we can give something that, like people haven't heard before? Um, so
They were fighting the
yeah,
battles of their day, you know. I mean,
yeah,
and they're products of their time, you know. I very rarely try to go back and grab a theologian for my side. I know that Calvin, in his institutes, I remember reading it. He blinds up like all the scholastic people for him, with the exception of Augustine. He says, "I reject all of them." He had to. He had to. They all disagree with him, but he had to reject them because he was saying something new that they hadn't said before. And or they had at least broached the topic, and he just said, I just reject all these people. And um, I very rarely go back and try and say, well, look at this theologian, he agrees with me. That's kind of irrelevant to me. Um,
right.
Very few people, as you've probably found, talk about Deuteronomy 12:32 or Deuteronomy 4:2 and even address the idea of living life without a legislature. So you might have come across Meredith Kline, but as Meredith Kline come say, I wonder if that would be good for our time. Does he even talk about it? I suspect he doesn't. He's just like, hey, look, this would prohibit a legislature. But I suspect it doesn't go much further than that. And there's just very little material out there, even addressing, like, if you could find a Bonson or Rushdoony quote where they say, here's the idea. Some people believe that we shouldn't have a legislature, and I reject that, and here's why. Then, okay, then I'm paying attention and I'm listening, right? But if he's not addressing the position and people are trying to like grab him for their side, I can't afford to care that much because he's not addressing the position. And a lot of my conclusions are from a lecture that he did that I was making a promotion for one of our conferences, and I was listening to this lecture. I was using his lecture as a promotion, and I recently went back to it and listened to it again. I was like, man, a lot of my ideas came from this lecture from Rushdoony. It's like, how could you not conclude non-legislative theonomy from this lecture? But he wasn't talking about that, right? It's just the consistent application of what he says, following his statements to the logical conclusion. And I think the problem, if I could say there's a problem, but I think maybe the blind spot or the shortcoming with Rushdoony was he was trying to bring in the Constitution. And I think the shortcoming with Bonson, he was trying to bring in the Westminster Confession. And I think that prohibited them from taking the statements to their logical conclusions all the way. I think they went far, but I think that there was these impediments that stopped them from going all the way. That were just I think they were impediments because they were trying to bring it in, and that's the only sense I can make out of it, right? Obviously, I haven't read all of their stuff, but that's the only sense I can make out of it. Why didn't they talk about non-legislative theonomy? Well, because Bonson was trying to salvage general equity, the term, because it's in the Westminster Confession, and Rush was trying to bring in the Constitution because he loved American history so much. And that's my speculation. I'm not going to say that's definitely what's happening, but that's the only sense I can make out of it.
If somebody was like completely new to what we're talking about, non-legislative theonomy, how would you define, let's say somebody doesn't even know what theonomy is. How would you define non-legislative theonomy?
So theonomy is just simply understood as God's law as the standard of justice for a nation. That's just what it is. God's law is the standard of justice for a nation. So God's law, God has told us how to be a nation before he's told us how to be a church. And in that law, it gives responsibility to this different spheres of government. And so if someone says, well, what's non-legislative theonomy? I would say it's just basically, it's God's law, instituting God's law in such a way that it outlaws the institution of wickedness, right? No one has the power or the authority to institute their own ideas. And non-legislative theonomy, if we did it, it would be similar to ancient Israel in that if we instituted God's law, we would recognize Christ as king, right? That's one of the requirements of non-legislative theonomy. And if we did that, you basically have a culture that's run by tradition, and when things go south, it's run by law. And you would basically live life without a lawmaking body, and there would be no one there to change or alter the laws. And this would affect our thinking in such a way. And I think our understanding of what a nation is would change once we started to live this way. I think our understanding of a lot of things would change as we started to remove the statist influence and the Roman influence and the Catholic influence and the pagan influence that we're just coming out of ever since Christ was resurrected. I think a lot of that would start to go away, and we'd be able to see a lot more clearly the world through a society that views the world through the law of God, with the eyes of the law of God. I think a lot of our cloudy, like, I don't understand this. I think a lot of it would become very enlightening to the reality of the world and the reality of human nature and the reality of justice. So if someone said, well, I don't know what non-legislative theonomy is, I would say it's just God's law. And in God's law, it's uh, it's instituted in such a way that wickedness is not um, never in a position to be instituted. And the righteous are perpetually at an advantage in the courtroom. That's what God's law does. It puts people who are in the right perpetually at an advantage in the courtroom, whereas any other system eventually puts wicked people at the advantage in the courtroom, and the righteous begin to be persecuted. So that would be my short definition, to be God's law instituted in such a way that no one else is allowed to institute their laws.
And then, so if somebody, obviously, so Bahnsen coins the term general equity theonomy because he's trying to be confessional.
Yeah.
Um, but then general equity theonomy, it's not when the term is used today, like when Doug is using the term or when other guys are using the term, it doesn't seem like they're not really using it because they're just saying this is this term that comes from the confession and we're theonomic. So here's general equity theonomy. What they mean is we want to take principles that we derive from the Mosaic Law and then allow the legislature to go wild with those principles and create anything that we think could or may or may not be a problem.
Yeah, as long as as long as you can tie it back and to not even sometimes not even God's law, just a Bible verse. I mean, I've seen people abuse Romans 13 and say, "Look, the magistrate is supposed to be looking out for my welfare." Well, where'd you get that from? Look, Romans 13. He's a messenger. He's a servant for your good. Well, that's a horrible exegesis. I mean, that's absolutely terrible exegesis. Okay? Does that mean? I mean, my good would be to lose probably 20 pounds, right? Does he have the authority to tell me to lose 20 pounds? And they say, well, no. Okay, where's the line? And general equity theonomy is a biblical system of degrees, but there's no line. You can't stop anywhere because it's just a principle. God's law becomes principles, and man's principles becomes law. And that's what happens every single time. And for some reason, general equity theonomy people, whenever I'm talking to them, very rarely do they actually talk about the law of God. They very rarely are like, very rarely see, yes, I want to see this law from God's law instituted just the way that it is. Yes, just this one right here. I want to see that one instituted purely. I don't want to take the principle. I don't want to take the kind of like the spirit of it and institute it and turn it into my own thing. I want to take this law right here because I love this law and it's a good one. Very rarely will I see that by general equity theonomists. It's so weird. There's some sort of weird spirit among not all of them, but many of them that I've seen that doesn't make sense to me, where they stop arguing for God's law and they start arguing for their interpretation of the spirit of a certain law. And I'm just looking at this going, I thought we were theonomists. I thought we were all about God's law, not my own dumb ideas about what laws I think should be in the nation. And I've seen people come up with, they call themselves general equity theonomists, and I'm like, the things and what they always go to, not always, but what I've seen it go to a lot with it when I get in the general equity discussion, we go to speed limits. Like it's laughable at this point. We go to speed limits to justify speed limits. It's so bizarre to me. I can't believe we're talking about speed limits. But they say, look, do you take the Sixth Amendment? You shall not murder. Therefore, the state should own the roads. Therefore, it's wrong for you to go 1 mile above the speed limit. And I've seen people say that to my face. They call themselves theonomists. Yes, speeding is a sin. And I just look at that. I just have to shake my head and say, what are we doing here? I mean, you sound like a Christian nationalist. You sound like a communist, for Pete's sakes. And you call yourself a general equity theonomist? That is so bizarre that we're now becoming ambassadors of the state and telling other people, if you speed, you're in sin. And I thought we were supposed to be ambassadors of Christ, and this is not it. And general equity theonomy, one of the things why I called Christian nationalism Catholic Junior is because Christian nationalism can't stop Catholicism. the Christian nationalism focuses on tradition as authoritative. It just does, right? I mean, that's what Wolf does at the beginning of his book. I just assume the Reformed tradition. I assume I don't argue for it. I don't establish it. I just assume that it's true. And I'm like, that's what the Catholics do. I just assume that everything that all the traditions are right. I don't defend them. I just assume that they're true, right? And there's no bulwark against Catholicism in Christian nationalism. And I submit to you that many of the Christian nationalists are heading towards Anglicanism, Lutheranism, if you're lucky, Presbyterianism. But I think a lot of them are heading Catholic because you'll never out-tradition the Catholics. The Catholics are going to win that battle 100% of the time. And my problem with general equity theonomists is the Christian nationalists are doing general equity theonomy better than you. They have a much more developed system of how we take these principles, and it's like this almost Hindu level of principles where like millions of them, and we're now telling people where to put their pulpit, as Wolf says in his book, and we're punishing people for not going to church, and it's actually become worse because now we have a dictator ordering our lives for us, and the situation becomes worse for us eventually. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. And I think the general equity theonomists are vulnerable to classical liberalism, and Christian nationalism. And I think they're going to lose. They lose the arguments because they're just lesser versions of those two things. The way that general equity is currently understood, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like one of the guys that I'm really good friends with, he was like one of the only guys in a small group that I was in when I was in high school that would be listening to the same sorts of guys. And he was a big
Is that
follower
Camden?
of, say what?
Is that Camden?
It's not Camden.
No,
Different
it's not
guy.
Camden.
Different
Okay,
guy.
got it.
So he was a big follower of Doug, and he was looking at guys like Peter Leithart and different pastors and theologians in the Series C, and eventually Doug posts or publishes Stephen Wolf's book, and now this guy is completely a Christian nationalism. He wouldn't, or a Christian nationalist. He wouldn't even say that he's a theonomist anymore. He would completely deny being a theonomist. So at least he's consistent on that front. But what's interesting is if you just bring in Deuteronomy 4:2, if you just say, okay, so if we're forbidden from adding to the words which God has commanded us, and we're forbidden from diminishing aught from them, then there's no law. Like if God's law is complete, as it says in Psalm 19, then there's no law that like he couldn't anticipate that this evil would happen in culture. And so now the government needs to come up and create new laws to guard against this thing that God couldn't have anticipated or didn't anticipate in his law. So
Yeah.
it's almost like if theonomy is going to survive the different guys that are popular right now with Christian nationalism, then we need to say God's law as it stands is our standard alone, and that judges must adjudicate from that law. We can't just have a system that tries to guard against any, like a paternal state, any issue that we might find in society, immediately go to the state. They're the solution instead of human ingenuity. It's like, okay, if you have the speed limit problem, could we not just have businesses that can create a system where they're making money? It's private property and it's guarded in some way, and then they go on, they charge people a certain amount, and then if you violate the terms of use of their property, then the person's penalized in some way. Like it would seem like as long as we just allow for humans to have dominion over the earth as God created us for, then we don't need a legislation, or we don't need a legislative branch.
Yeah. And that's one of the other things that I kind of a conclusion I came to when I was thinking about all this was what is our purpose in life? It's dominion, right? This is a neglected one. I mean, that's the first thing. Here's the world. God shows us, and He doesn't say, "Glorify me and enjoy me forever." I think that's okay. I think that's notable. He didn't say that. Okay, what He said was, fill the earth, subdue it, and have lots of kids. All right, that's our purpose. Did God create a system that got in the way of that purpose, or did He give us a system that prospered that purpose? Well, of course it didn't get in the way of it. It prospered that purpose, right? That God's law helps us take dominion. It helps us in that purpose. Okay, what is a system that gets away with it? Gets away with it? Well, I mean, there's a lot of systems. Basically, any other system besides God's system, because it doesn't take into account man's purpose. None of them do. Not one. Constitutional republicanism, anarcho-capitalism, communism, socialism, all that Christian nationalism. None of them take into account God's purpose for mankind here on earth. Because if they did, they'd say, okay, well, if God gave us a purpose, um, he's not going to give us impediments to that purpose, right? He's not going to put anything in our way. He's not going to contradict himself, but all of his law is actually going to help prosper that purpose. And so if we are at maximum dominion functioning level when we're following God's law, right? Love is the fulfillment of the law. I'm loving God, I'm loving my neighbor. What can I be doing wrong outside of that? If I'm following God's law, that means I'm loving God, I'm loving my neighbor. What am I doing wrong outside of that? How can I be punished by the state if I'm loving God and loving my neighbor? And okay, if I follow the law and I keep the law and I'm fulfilling it, obviously nobody's arguing that the law saves people. No, I've never heard a Reconstructionist say that. But we're talking about now that we are saved, how then shall we live? And if God says, okay, or Jesus says, love is a fulfillment of the law, and if the law and the prophets are about loving God and loving your neighbor, if I'm loving God, I'm going to love my neighbor. Do I need governing? Well, the answer is no. You do not need to be approached by the state in any way, shape, or form, right? You don't. But the people who are arguing for any law system outside of God's law system are saying, actually, yes, you are. You do need to be approached by the state, even though you're loving God and loving your neighbor. You still need to be approached by the state. Here's what you lack: you're not following the speed limit. You're not paying your taxes. And you didn't build a house the right way. Well, and so this presupposition or this belief in the claims of Scripture that when you're keeping the law and fulfilling the law, um, you're loving God and you're loving your neighbor. And outside of that, for someone to come along and say, "But here's what you lack. You didn't do this, and you need to be punished, and you need to be regulated, and you need to be ordered by the state." Beyond that, I think is insanity.
So one claim that I would have that I think any Reconstructionist would agree with is that the actual vision of Christian Reconstruction is inevitable. So if you look to the promises in Psalm 2 or Isaiah 2, the promises concerning the future, well, like Christian Reconstruction is the same vision. Like the vision of Christian Reconstruction is what is found in
Yes.
Isaiah 2 or in 1 Corinthians 15. We do see the nations turning to God and flowing to Zion. We do see the law of God going out, the nations being discipled by the law of God, and then having peace with one another. And so, what we can kind of, I think what we would say is that, like, for example, with Deuteronomy, at the beginning of Deuteronomy, from Deuteronomy 1 to Deuteronomy 4, you see this history of Israel as they are with God, as their Lord. And the generation that should have inherited the land was unfaithful. And so what does God do? He waits for another generation, and the generation that was unfaithful died out. He let them die out.
Yes.
And so I think what any Reconstructionist would say is there is a time where the meek will inherit the earth. Of course, we
Yes.
are going to inherit the earth. The only question is, are we going to be a faithful generation that receives the promises of God by faith so that we might inherit the land? And my
Yes.
question for you is, what do you think are the areas that we can be building, that we can be showing steps of faithfulness to God so that we can continue to build and take dominion, basically?
Um, Obviously, the just like the time of the Reformation, the sphere of government that was out of control was the church, and it needed to be reined in. For our day, it's the state. It needs to be reined in. So I'm not somebody who believes that we need a Christian majority or a big, great working of the Spirit before we see positive change. I'm not somebody who has to say that that needs to happen. It could happen. It might not happen. Um, you know, the separatists, did they receive a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit before they basically started America? Well, no, it was very small, and I don't see this great outpouring of the Holy Spirit there. They were just being faithful where they were, like you said, with what they had, and that was enough to start the Christian ethos of America as a very small beginning. But there wasn't this great revival before they came to America, unless you want to say, okay, the Puritans and all that kind of stuff, maybe. Um, but as far as what can we do now, the Bible says, Psalm 119, I will speak of your testimonies before kings and not be put to shame. We've got to stop being ashamed of the law of God. We've got to stop. We've just got to stop it. We got to tell people, um, do you stand by this law? Yes, yes, I do. I do stand by that law, and I don't stand by your understanding of that law. I don't stand by that. People do it all the time. Well, this law means this. Well, I don't understand. I don't stand by your understanding by the law, but just the plain reading of the law. I stand by that, and we've got to stop being ashamed of it. So I put a lot of emphasis on the pastors. I don't. And if you're going to say, okay, what's going to happen? I say, I don't think if I think if the pastors don't do anything, I don't think anything's going to happen. That's my bid there. That's my take. We've got to start going to our pastors and saying, "Teach me the law." I don't know what it means. I don't know what it is. I'm clueless. If I was to go up to your average, sometimes even theonomists, but let's just say average Christian, and say, "Tell me about your government." Oh, well, it's bicameral legislature, and we have a president, and they change every 4 years, and we have three branches of government, and we have state, we have federal, and we have state, and then we have municipal, and we have the House of Representatives, and then we have the Senate, and this process of the veto process with something, all these features of their government, right? Most Americans know, and I say, okay, tell me some features of God's government. Blank expression. They don't know anything. They're clueless. And if they don't know God's government, they have nothing to compare our system to and say, maybe we shouldn't have that office. I see that office is there. I see that department. Maybe we shouldn't have it. No one's considered it. Very few have considered it. I think the Christian Reconstructionists are considering it. But very few are actually looking at the government and saying, this is not a good government because I have something to compare it to. But since we have this blank area in our minds about God's government, we have nothing to compare our government to say, here's the shortcomings and here are the successes. So I think people need to be going to the pastors and saying, look, I want you to teach me God's law. Teach it to me. I want to know what it was like to live in that system back then. I want to know what the expectations were, what the standards of justice were, how they did things. I want to know the features of God's government. What did they have? What was the leader? How did their government system work? Where are they able to experience more peace than we are with all of our enlightened reasoning and Lockeanism and ostensible Deuteronomy quoting? Why did they experience more rest than us? I want you to teach me God's law. And I think the pastors need to teach people God's law. And I often go to this example of the Stamp Act in Virginia back during Patrick Henry's time, when he gave this really great speech against that was the give me liberty or give me death time, and he gave this really great speech against the Stamp Act. And I think he would not have been anywhere remotely successful without the church preaching what he was saying from the pulpit, that the state doesn't have the right to do this. And when the enforcers of the crown came to Virginia, they got off the boat and they're like, okay, let's start. We're doing the Stamp Act. It's starting today. We're doing it. Nobody complied, down to the man. Not one single person. And I think, in Virginia anyway, and I think the reason that was because they were preaching it from the pulpits. The church was being faithful, and the pulpits, from the Baptists to the Methodists to the Congregationalists to the Presbyterians, were all saying, no, don't comply with this. This is wrong. This is wicked. The pastors were being prophets to the people. They were being the voice of God about the requirements of the magistrate. Our pastors don't do that. We've given up the prophetic function. The pastors won't leave the pulpits. They'll tickle the people's ears. They will not teach people the law because they don't know it themselves. I just listened to, this is really sad. And I did a podcast on a podcast done by John Harris from Conversations That Matter, with James Baird in his new book King of Kings, and he argues for the Reformed tradition view of the magistrate. And he said something that I thought was very interesting. He said, when I was in seminary, there were some, I guess, some classes that were being done on the Reformed view of the magistrate, and I would have just skipped them. I wasn't interested in that. And I was listening, and I was horrified. Why you're going to seminary and you're learning how to be a pastor, and you're not interested in the role of the magistrate? That's not interesting to you? That's really sad. That seminary should have grabbed him and put him under discipline and said, you absolutely need to learn what the role of the magistrate is so you can speak to the magistrate and tell him his business. That's your job. You don't just wait for people to come to you. You got to go to people. And our pastors have made peace with like this idea of, well, I'm just going to sit on my fat butt in the pulpit and wait for people to come to me. And if people don't come to me, then I'll write out a newsletter and go look for a new church because I'll close down that church. And the same guy, James Barrett, was saying, I mean, it's such a bad view, in my opinion, respectfully to him, of the civil magistrate, because he says, I'm not even allowed, he says, as a pastor, I'm not qualified to talk about civil matters. And I'm like, that is so counter-biblical. That is not a claim made by the scriptures. You don't see that anywhere. These prophets, time and time again, would walk right up to the king, stick their nose in his fat face and say, thus says the Lord. And they were they were nobodies. Who were these people? They were nobodies. Look at the disciples. They were also nobodies. They perceived they were uneducated men. Who were they to tell people, these Pharisees, about the Bible? But they did, because God's law and God's word from Genesis to Revelation is authoritative over whatever human institutions we've put in place. And so if you know God's law, you are always in a position to be authoritative on the matter of justice and on the matter of the magistrate. But we have people walking around saying, making peace with, yeah, well, I mean, I was in seminary. I wasn't interested in what the magistrate was supposed to do, which is an absolute disgrace. And secondly, after that, later concluding that, well, as a pastor, I'm not qualified to talk about these matters, which is, to me, insane. So what can we do now? We can go to our pastor saying, teach me the law. And if your pastor won't teach you the law, tell the pastor to teach the law. Get on him and say, keep teaching me the law. Get on him. And to tell our pastors, you got to stop talking to us in here. All right? There's people out in the street. There's magistrates that need to hear what you're saying. They're not coming here. You need to go to them. Go to the commissioners meeting. My dad goes to the commissioners meeting. All right? And he goes there and he sits and he gets his 2 minutes, and they have to listen to him. They have to sit there and listen to him, and he just preaches at them. And I think that's faithfulness. And if a quarter of the pastors of Lancaster County did that, you would see a lot of positive change. But they won't do it, because we've made peace with this idea that I sit in the church, people come and they listen to me and they respect me, and then we all go home. But they won't leave their pulpits and go speak to the culture. They won't leave and go speak to magistrates. So the people of this nation need to put pressure on our pastors to fulfill their God-given role as shepherds. You got to stop just watching the sheep. You got to start fighting the wolves, because the wolves are eating the sheep. And the more that you sit there and watch the wolves eat, the less faithful you are in what God has told you to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely, I'm actually, well, I might not. Maybe I'll tell you after we finish recording. But um, one thing that I wanted to talk about was the way that the community of Christian Reconstruction can unify, or at least support each other. So I think, it's like Paul in Romans 1. He's longing to be with the Romans, or this church in Rome, because he has affection for them. They're one in Christ, and so he's longing so that I forget the exact way that he phrases it, but it's almost like that the Spirit can be shared between each other. So he's longing to be with each other. Specifically, he's saying obviously in person, so that he can admonish them, correct them, but also just encourage them. And so one thing that obviously was missing in the first generation was unity. there was a whole lot of division. It's kind of, I mean, Christian Reconstruction in a lot of ways is kind of like a Puritan-like movement. It's like this grassroots, um,
Yes.
in many ways divisive movement. And so there are a lot of guys that I think would greatly benefit when they first come in. Like I started getting interested in Christian Reconstruction because I was watching Jeff Durbin at Apologia, and they
Mm.
did some podcast episode about theonomy. So I liked all of his stuff when he's posting stuff about apologetics. I just found it interesting. And then he starts
Mm.
doing episodes about theonomy, does stuff about postmillennialism. And so initially I'm interested in postmillennialism, and I started kind of
Yes.
reading, interested in that. But then I have segued more to like really studying theonomy. And I think that if there were tangible ways that a young person who or whatever age person gets involved and wants to find some sort of way that they can get involved and find community, I think that that could be like incredibly beneficial. So I was just interested to hear
I
hear
think so
your
too.
thoughts on that.
How can the young people get involved?
Yeah, sure.
Is that what you want? Yeah, how the young people can get involved. Well, it's hard for me to recommend this because I haven't done this myself. I started it, but I haven't finished it. The first thing, it's really hard, but the first thing I would recommend is follow the requirements um, of Deuteronomy 17 and write out Deuteronomy with your own hand. Start there. Then you can no longer say, well, I didn't know, right? Now you know the standards of justice. Now you know the role of the magistrate. You wrote it out with your own hand. You can't say, well, I didn't know that. You can say, well, I forgot about that, but you can't say, well, I didn't know. And so if someone was getting into theonomy, my first recommendation before I even recommend a book is write out Deuteronomy with your own hand. That's what God expected of the king because he wanted him to know what justice was. So there was no excuse. And I think we need to bring that back as a tradition. I think everyone, and it's hard to say this because I haven't done it yet, but I think that's a good idea for everyone who is a theonomist to write out Deuteronomy with their own hand. And some would say maybe God was talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. It's the Pentateuch. But I think if you just write out Deuteronomy with your own hand as a start, um, I think that's what I recommend. Like, how can I learn more about theonomy? Write out Deuteronomy with your own hand, my friend. That's the
Yeah.
first thing I recommend. And then after that, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law. It's just that's if you want to know, and then and if that's too technical for you, then I recommend Joe Booth's Mission of God as these introductory books. But if you're talking about like activism, um, the greatest activism I can recommend is what God told Adam and Eve: take dominion of the earth, be fruitful, multiply. That's the greatest activism I can recommend to you.
Hmm.
Those two things will have the most lasting. The pagans are giving it to us on a silver platter. They are not having children. They're killing their own babies. They're basically saying, here's the culture. It's free to take. If you guys would just have kids around here, here it is. We're giving it to you. But we keep on compromising and we keep on giving it right back by sending our kids to be educated by them, who then grow up to have no children and our lines get cut off. So they're given to us on a silver platter, and we could just destroy them just by outproducing them. But we can't even do that because our churches are so perverse and corrupt, and nobody speaks against public school from the pulpit, largely speaking. But if someone was like, "Yeah, I'm looking to get into theonomy," I'd say write out Deuteronomy with your own hand. And secondly, um, uh, take dominion, be good at your job, develop your job, or get a good career, and then have family and be fruitful and multiply. As soon as you've had three, you've multiplied. All right, so at least have three kids, and that's what I would recommend for young people. Live faithfully with what you have now. Trust the Lord with the fruit, and put ambition in its proper place. be careful with ambition. I've seen a lot of people perverted and corrupted by it. They just want to be somebody. They want to be platformed, and they've said and done horrible things because of that desire. Just be, like I said. I mean, from the scriptures, what does Jesus say to his disciples? When everything's said and done, here's your response: we are unworthy servants. We're just doing what we're told. Okay, that's what our attitude should be as Christian Reconstructionists. We're unworthy servants. We're just doing what we're told. God told us to take dominion. That's what we're doing. God told us to be fruitful, multiply. That's what we're doing. Told us to love God. That's what we're doing. Told us to love our neighbor. Told us to go out and preach the gospel to all nations. That's what we're doing. And we're trying to protect the gospel in this land, because the state is attacking the gospel message. And the only way to perpetually protect the gospel message is through God's law.
Yeah, I would add to that, because this has been something that's been so helpful for me and also for Camden. Is like, if you look in Deuteronomy 6, they're supposed to have the law of God basically plastered everywhere, and they're supposed to go and talk about it while they're sitting down and while they're walking by the way. And
Yep.
so I it's almost like there's this community where they're just constantly interacting with and talking about the law of God. And then of
Yes.
course there's like, people actually commit sin or crime in their area, and then that has to be dealt with according to God's law. So of course they would actually see it. Um, but
Yes.
but for me, I mean, definitely joining Theonomy Q&A and having like a virtual version of that, where you can constantly be just saying, okay, well, here's this law. This is kind of how I would see it. How would you look at this?
Yes.
Interacting with people. It's just that sort of thing where the community, there's older men who have spent decades,
Yeah.
or years just thinking about these things. And so then you could throw something out and they're like, well, have you ever thought of this? And it just, yeah, I think that that's an incredible way, because you're not, I mean, how many guys are going to come to believe in or take seriously God's law, and then they're going to go, and there are like several men in their church, so that they can go and talk to their pastor now about God's law. I mean, it's probably very, very rare. So,
Yes.
um,
It's unfortunate, but it's true.
yeah, yeah,
But uh, the internet, with all of its problems, I think, if it were up to Satan, he'd have no internet. And I think a lot of Christians view it the opposite. I think they look at the internet as a product of Satan. But I think the tools God gives us, they're more effective as tools for the righteous than they are as weapons for the wicked. The enemy loves to take God's tools and turn them into weapons against his own people. That's what happened with the internet. Um, but I think the tools that we use, for God's kingdom, are more effective than the perverse weapons that the enemies use. So to me, it's worth it, because it's a tool for dominion. That's what God gave us. And I think Satan hates the internet. I think he wants to pervert it. That's what he's doing. He's doing it effectively. But I think, history will, as history is going forward, um, the internet will go down as, being viewed positively by um, our children, because it will have assisted in the furthering of God's kingdom more than it will have assisted in the furthering of Satan's kingdom. That's what I believe.
all right, awesome, awesome. Is there anything you want to add? Anything that's going on with Future of Christendom that you'd like to just plug?
Yeah, so thanks, Gil. Um, we are doing our Theonomy Symposium. It's where I met you in Camden last time. That was a lot of fun. We had a lot of people come out to that. We're doing it again, Lancaster and Theonomy Symposium. I we just believe that this, um, God's system, as He explained it in His Word, um, it's just the answer to a lot of our problems. We just believe that it really is the answer to a lot of our problems. To the law and the testimonies, right? If they be not of these, there's no dawn in them, right? And we believe that there are problems in theonomy that need to be addressed, and there are shortcomings that are stopping us from being as effective as we could be in bringing God's kingdom here on earth, and being, effective, in our day and age, and being faithful to Christ and His Word. So that's why we take these Lancaster Theonomy Symposiums seriously, um, because we do believe that while we might not see the fruit in our day, they will be used as fruit to combat the wickedness of our time and of our children's time. And we take it very seriously. So we have a theonomy, Lancastrian theonomy symposium coming up. It's May or March of next year, and then we have our Future of Christendom 2026 conference coming up as well in October. And everyone can go to futureofchristendom.org for more details on these and for a lot of great content on past conferences, even our past Theonomy Symposium conference,
Awesome.
just one.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Gil, for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor. I really love your work. I quote a lot of that podcast you did where you were taking a look at the leaders of Christian nationalism. You're like, something stinks in the land of Christian nationalism, and the research was on point when you were quoting what these people were saying. It was even eye-opening for me, and I've been watching these guys like hounds the last couple of years, and even I was shocked at what you dug up. I was like, oh my word, I can't believe this. So really great stuff. Love your podcast.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that. Awesome. Awesome. Well, this has been the Solo Lex Dei podcast. Next episode, I should be bringing on just one of my friends and talking about paradigm shifts that he's had in his own theology and how to approach that. So, yeah, anyway, I'll see you next time.